William Randolph Hackley in his diary. First, on diaries, it's an interesting thing that very few people keep diaries. And most people who keep diaries keep them because they're bored, like sailors and soldiers that are stationed in the military and have plenty of time to sit around and do nothing all day. So then they're usually full of pretty much the same thing because they don't do anything. But it's unusual to find one from some guy that faithfully carries out the diaries and has a position of importance and knows what's going on and records it. And in this case, Hackley was that kind of person. And the other thing on diaries, of course, is survivable to the present time. So many of them get lost in families, fires, thrown away because nobody's interested, and so forth. So we're lucky that this diary survived. And Hackley himself, William Randolph, was born in 1806 in Virginia to a extremely, probably at the time, the most powerful political family in the state and in the nation. His mother's brother was Thomas Mann Randolph, who was governor of Virginia, who was married to Jefferson's daughter, and in fact lived part of the time in Monticello. So he comes with a lot of horsepower there. His father was a successful merchant, Hackley, and was appointed U.S. consul in Spain, and was there for about 20 years, as best I can figure, about 20 years in Spain. The last part was in Cadiz, which is on the Atlantic coast, major port. In fact, it's the port area where Columbus sailed from to discover the New World, and where we have a naval base there at Rota, Spain, which is across the bay from Cadiz. So Hackley spent part of his youth in Spain and had a command, how good we don't know, of the Spanish language. So when he was here, he spoke Spanish, which would have been rare for most North Americans at that time here. One of the things that happened was when his father was in Spain, his father acquired or bought or whatever a land grant, a Spanish land grant had been given to the Duke of Alagón, which was 12 million acres of land, basically from Tampa to Orlando, the west coast of Florida. It was a land grant. And that was to play a part in his life. The land grant was actually disallowed by the commission that was established after we acquired Florida from Spain, but they kept pursuing it, and that was part of the reason. And in fact, the family pursued it and people pursued it. The last case that I found was involving this land grant was in the 1940s. So they persisted for at least 100 years of lawsuits over this land grant, which were all disallowed. So anyway, our boy William returned from Spain with his parents, and he did attend William and Mary College for 1 year, 23 to 24, 1823 to 24. Between 24 and 26, he probably was reading law somewhere in a law office in Virginia. We're not sure of what he was doing in those 2 years. But he landed in Florida in 1826, and he applied and was given a license to practice law in Florida. And so he's first in Tallahassee, and then 1828 he arrives in Key West, establishes law practice. And he started his diary then. And in fact, in his diary, he said he was doing it at that time to improve his handwriting, because lawyers in those days, everything was handwritten, all documents. he started his diary. Now, his diary didn't survive all of it, but one year it did survive in the 20s. And like most diaries, he says what he wants to. He don't always follow up and tell you, particularly when things don't go well. Part of his diary, of course, was lost in a fire and saved. But one of the things he did is he brought a diving bell down here looking for the Spanish shipwrecks. A number of the early people in Key West knew the Atosha was out there somewhere, and they were looking for him. But he doesn't ever tell us anything about his diving bell. Just there was an article in a newspaper about him having it here. So he was here as a single man during that first time. So the diaries about the guys, they're playing cards and they're drinking and doing hunting and shooting and fishing some and stuff like that. And it's a pretty good diary for about a year there. Then he leaves, and when he returns later, he starts his diary again, but that's the part that's lost, so we don't find it. In 1841, he finally marries Matilda Volker, who was from Charleston. Her family was in Charleston and Savannah, so old maritime southern people. Her father was a physician in Charleston at the time, and she was 16 years old when they got married, and he was 35. But the way they probably met is her sister, Sarah, was married to Alexander Patterson. And in the diary, you see Sister Sarah all the time mentioned, and they were very close, Matilda and Sarah Patterson, always sharing stuff. But seemed to have worked out all right, even though she was very young. 1849, with his political connection, he was appointed district attorney, U.S. District Court, Southern District of Florida. So besides his law practice, he was the district attorney. And the U.S. court was setting an admiralty as the wrecking court. That's what his famous for in the wrecking court. The U.S. court was famous for handling all the shipwrecks on the reef. Like I said, part of the diary is missing, and it was saved. Actually, his grandson was the one that seemed to have saved it. Robert Golding, who was a professor, who was head of the Department of Education at Florida State, and then later founded the Department of Education at the University of Jacksonville. And in fact, the diary ended up being stuck in the corner of his papers, which are at Florida State. That's where we finally found the remains of the original diary. But the best part of the diary is the years from 1853 to 57, where he was the faithful, keeping the diary every day, and you get a good feel of what was going on. And as all good diarists he did, he recorded the weather. And in fact, the weather was taken out by the U.S. Weather Service and entered into their basic weather computers, because before the weather department was started. So he gives us a view of life in Key West at the time. Now, he's noted, and people who read the diary note, he walks a lot, which he does. But you got to remember, at that time, everybody walked. You had to be very rich to afford a horse and buggy. There was no public transportation, so the only way around town was walking. So that was one, but he walked more than excess. Often, he lived most of the time in a house on where the post office is today on Whitehead Street. The house is long since gone. And of course, he practiced law in the federal building of the courthouse down where the custom house is today. and sometime maybe in the county courthouse, basically next door to where he lived. But in the mornings he would get up and walk. Now he got up early, but everybody in those days got up early because in a lot of his things, he stops by the market to buy meat or fish or something for dinner. And so in the days before refrigeration, of course, the market people that were going to slaughter the sheep, the cow, or the turtle that they were going to sell had to do it that day, have it ready to pick up in the morning because it had to be cooked and consumed that day. And a couple times they didn't succeed, and he gets sick, and he records that because he got some bad food, which was a common occurrence in those days, that people would eat something that had been out too long. But his walking, he would often walk from his house. Some of the places he would go would be down by the barracks, which is today Perry Court, to the salt ponds, or pans really, where they were making salt. And they were located about where Key West High School is today. And he would come back by the beach, which the beach was pretty much from Higgs Beach down to the end of the island where the Navy is today. You can't walk all the way there, but to the end of the island. And he'd go back by Fort Taylor. Now, during this time, of course, Fort Taylor's being built. He's friends with the engineer, so he keeps a track of the fort and what's going on and that. So he was an interesting and turned out to be well out of his time to be a health nut because he said he'd started chewing tobacco when he was 12 years old in Virginia, but he quit all use of tobacco. He quit all use of alcoholic beverages. He pretty much became, I won't say a complete vegetarian, but he was off of a lot of meat, and evidently was eating stews and stuff, fish and birds and stuff. And so the other thing that was very unusual, he took a bath almost daily. And he had a tub and a pump groundwater into his tub. Of course, he had no heating system, so it was cold water. So take a bath every day. In the summertime, it's not bad, but in the wintertime, it took some fortitude to get his bath in. But we'll have a map that will show on some of the track. And I say they went walking because there was only certain paths you could get around the island that people had made. And we have a map that shows them in color of where the main paths were. This was a map done by the military in 1860, so it's close to what he was doing in his walking about. He did do a lot of shooting and hunting. Again, this was for food, and he did some fishing. He wasn't as big a fisherman as you might have thought. What was life like, family life? Is they would, of course, visit with one another, and it was common at night to go visit and sit with somebody, because that's the way you would get information about. Of course, he was a big reader, read all the newspapers he got in. Of course, they'd be sometime weeks late by the time we found out what was going on here, and read a lot of books. So he would go visit, and they would sit and talk and so forth. It's interesting that very little mention of the heat in the days with no fan, no air condition, no nothing. And occasionally he would mention mosquitoes and how that they were bad that particular day. And occasionally you'd see he would sleep under a mosquito net, or mosquito bar as they call it in those days. And if you've ever used a mosquito bar, you sleep under it, it raises the temperature about 10 degrees. So if it's 90 outside and you're trying to sleep in a mosquito bar without a fan or anything, it's going to be 100 degrees under there. So anyway, he had a number of children. He ended up 4 daughters lived to maturity. He had a son that was born here and died shortly after birth. He had a couple sons that were born later, but neither one of them lived to maturity there. So he has the 4 daughters, Harriet, Charlotte, Sarah, and Lucia. And Lucia is the one that's the babe that's born here in the diary in 1855, and is not a well child. She has a lot of illnesses, which he treats, of course. He was also a member of St. Paul's Church, and Matilda was a member of the choir, and evidently he also took part in the choir practice sometime, because he said he was going singing, and he doesn't always explain everything, but he would go with Matilda to choir practice quite often. So, and of course they spent a lot of time with Sister Sarah and Alexander Patterson. Often the women would get together and spend a day together at one another's house, and then they would have dinner at that house. So it was part of, and people would just come and visit, people from out of town. The major who was building the fort would come and visit.